Welcome to Aquarium 911, where I help you with your aquarium problems. Today, we're going to be dealing with a problem that is kind of twofold in a planet aquarium. One, we've got a number of plants that, once they kind of start getting up toward the surface of the water, they start dying back, and they're not doing so well. And then two, Anubias rot. This is probably the core problem that we actually need to focus on, but let's get into our email, figure out where the problems are, and then talk about my action plan for finding long-term success. Today's email comes from Adrian. Good evening, Bentley. I hope everything is well with you and the family. I have recently added some established Anubias to my 75-gallon, which is a new setup with a fully mature filter. I always laugh a little bit when you're like, it's a new setup, but it has a fully mature filter, right? Because in theory, for a fully mature filter, you actually have the whole ecosystem mature at that point. But I understand what you mean, in the sense that you have bacteria seeded into the filter and it's ready to go and handle things. I'm playing semantics. Sorry. And I cannot for the life of me figure out what's killing all of them from one side of the tank. So it's happening specifically on one side of the tank, which is very interesting, while leaving the other side completely unscathed with new growth. My guess is the fungus growing on the driftwood that has probably found its way onto the rhizome, but then again, I'm not sure why it would even do that. Weirdly enough, one Anubias on the infected side actually has a pretty big new leaf coming in. So I honestly have no clue what's even causing all the rot. I hope I can help them bounce back if it's possible. If it matters at all, the varieties experiencing rot are Cophifolia, Giant, and Nana Thickleaf. Would adding a bristlenose pleco, I currently have one in quarantine, or Borneo suckers, I have 5 in another tank, or a Siamese algae eater, I have a little dinky one in a quarantine, help with white fungus on the driftwood. It's not actually a fungus. Most of the time when we have it and it looks kind of white that's coming out, it's typically not an actual like fungus in a negative way. And I don't know of a better way to say that. It's just we need to get it out of our head thinking it, because a lot of people when they hear fungus, they assume like fish disease type funguses. And there are like beneficial fungi and other bacterial things that happen when the interaction of some of these substances leach out from the wood into the water. So let's, for our sake, let's not call it a fungus. I know someone in the comments is going to lose their mind, but because there's such a negative connotation with fungus, let's try and get away from that thought, because this isn't damaging to your aquarium. And more importantly, it's probably not actually the reason that the Anubias are having issue. But let's keep digging. Prevent that, or should I do something else to prevent whatever is going on from spreading to the other side of the tank? Regarding the crypt balance, it seems to be growing a certain length and just dying back from the tip. I've had this issue with Aponagina folia, and unfortunately, the 2 plants I had melted back too much that they didn't make it. If I am missing something, I'd love to hear about that, as my balance were like $30. You have some pictures in here in which they'll be up on screen so people can see what's going on. Thank you for your time. I hope we can find a solution to this, as I don't want to kill more of my Anubias and cryptocrines. Parameters: pH 7.6, GH 6 degrees, KH 13 degrees, phosphate 1 ppm, ammonia 0 ppm, nitrite 0 ppm, nitrate 10 ppm, 75-gallon aquarium, at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, no CO2, using a Fluval Aquasky 2.0, so you're going kind of low light. Not horrible, not bad, right, because you don't really have any super demanding plants, and I actually think you're being very smart by not putting an ultra-powerful light on this tank, given that the plants don't really require a lot of light. The only one that might want a little bit more is the Crypt Balance, but as it gets tall is where we're having problems, not when it's down low. If it was when it was down low, that's where I would start to worry about a light issue. So I think you're doing fine, but here's the actual settings, because I know I've skipped past that. I read them, but I didn't tell the rest of the audience. 35% except blue, which is at 3%. Sunrise is 8 to 10 a.m. Sunset is 1800 to 2000, so 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. So that means that we're getting about 8 hours of full light, and then 4 hours of sunrise sunset. So you've got kind of a nice long photo period, which is great for a lot of these plants using lower intensity light. I think a lot of your settings are actually really stellar and solid. And looking at like the full picture of your tank, like it is very pretty. I love the aquascape. I like what you're doing with it. So I think you got kudos there. We just need to solve a couple problems. Fertilization schedule. The Seachem Flourish line. We know that I have a personal dilemma with the Seachem Flourish line. However, if you are good at following it, it can be extremely effective. So that's all a matter of personal taste. Like, I hate having to buy 8,000 different products when I feel like I can buy 2 or 3. Mondays, 50% of everything, no advance. Tuesday, Excel, Potassium plus advance. Wednesdays, 50% of everything, no advance again. Thursdays, 50% of everything plus advance. Friday, Excel and Potassium. Saturday, Safe plus top off and clean filter intake sponges. Sunday, 50% everything and advance with a 50% bi-weekly water change. He's got a video in here and some pictures, and we've kind of cycled through that while I've been talking. So let's talk some of the details here. The first thing that stands out to me, and I kind of want to do a test, is one, if you can, go in and remove the bits of Anubias that are rotting. And the way that you'll need to do this is don't use scissors, but use a razor blade. Why? So, me and a number of my plant buddies who have talked over the years have noticed that whenever we try to trim or cut, divide our rhizomes, if we use scissors, those scissors will apply a small amount of crushing force. And we've noticed that if we don't use excessively sharp, very fine scissors, we exert that crushing force, and this can kind of trigger or aggravate Anubias rot. There is something where Anubias does not like to have the rhizome itself experience like crush force. So that's why we use razor blades, because they're very thin, excessively sharp. And if you can, use a brand new fresh one. Try not to use a used one. You want it as sharp as possible, and that it creates the cleanest cut possible. You could do the same thing with something like an X-Acto knife, but it just tends to be easier with a razor blade because you've got that nice fat wide blade. You're dealing with a big rhizome, right? You can just go, boop, cut it off, right? Remove as much rot as you can and get that all completely out of the tank. This has been kind of it's not a surefire way, but it's a really common way to try and fix or stall Anubias rot. Think of it like amputation with gangrene as a human being, right? It's a little gruesome, but you're getting rid of the infected tissue so that it can't continually progress further. Now, you have pretty good mineral content in your water with that 6 degrees of general hardness, and you've got a lot of KH, so your pH is going to be nice and stable. And one of the other things that I've noticed is that sometimes, and this happens a lot with crypts melting, and might be a little bit to what your balancing could, in theory, be experiencing, is when we have pH swings. But you're not having that, so I don't think that's your problem. You do have a little bit of hardness in your water, but you're not so crazy hardness oriented that it would become difficult for those plants to absorb nutrients. So here's what I think we can do. One, I would ask you this question. Did you glue all the rhizomes onto the wood? And when you did you do like a line all the way down the rhizome? And then the rhizomes on the other side of the tank, maybe they were friction fit in. And I know you're going to be like, that sounds a little crazy, Bentley. In my personal experience, anytime that I have glued on the rhizome directly, and instead of friction fitting things, or tying it down lightly, or finding a way to only glue like a portion of roots and not the rhizome itself, there seems to be something with the glue causing an issue in the rhizome that has led me to deal with rot more frequently in those particular cases. Is this a scientific thing? No, it is almost certainly an observation bias, but if it is something that's going on in this case, this is where I would say, like, if you've got a new rhizome that's sitting healthy, cut until you only have the healthy stuff. Even if you see a fresh leaf coming out of a part that's kind of rotting away, don't be afraid to cut that leaf off and chop off all that problem tissue. We basically need to kind of reset the plants if possible. The other thing we might look at is when we see bigger changes in water parameters, and often when we're going from tank to tank that doesn't happen, but we might have something going on. If you were to like test the tank it came from and test your current tank, maybe you'd find something different, like, oh, I tend to have more nitrate in this other tank, and I'm running pretty lean at only 10 ppm over here. To be very clear, I think that your parameters look fine. And I don't think it's a nutrition issue in the sense of too much of something or just none of it whatsoever. However, in the case of the balance A, I will have some suggestions that are nutrition related. The other thing that I would be really curious to try is just stop dosing Excel. Glutaraldehyde has a, and that's what Excel is glutaraldehyde, right? Liquid carbon, whatever the heck you want to call it. It tends to have some negative interactions with a number of different plant species. And while it's not typically known to have issues with Crips or Anubiases, because you are seeing some issues, I would almost be tempted to cut that out entirely and rely on everything else, and I might be dosing a bit more Flourish Trace. I don't know how often, just because you're not calling it out. You say 50% of everything, so I assume Trace is part of that. But if you're not dosing Trace, let's get Trace in the lineup, because what I have tended to find is when I start encountering some level of Anubias issue, almost always it's because I've neglected the micros in my tank and I have some kind of aggressive grower, or I'm just not dosing enough in the first place, and they're not getting enough of the micronutrients that they need in order to sustain that very healthy rhizome. It actually is a little bit nutrient intense compared to what we might think in our heads for Anubias to keep those rhizomes very, very healthy, right? They're holding a ton of nutrition in them. So by nature, to keep them healthy, to keep them strong, they need a reasonable amount of a diverse set of minerals to keep them healthy. Now you've got the hardness there, you've got some calcium and magnesium naturally in your water, that's great. You got a little carbon hardness, let's get rid of the Excel. Encourage you to start doing weekly water changes for a little while, especially while you're removing some of that material, because what we want to do is basically dilute the water. We're trying to like dilute whatever some of the problems might be and reset a little more frequently so that we have an opportunity to let those Anubiases get a little extra recovery. And we'll put this in quotation marks. Basically, we're resetting and then redosing to keep that kind of constant lean nutrition value, because you don't have a super high demand tank here. By doing that water change, we're making sure that some buildup isn't happening somewhere that we're not testing that might be negatively impacting those rhizomes. And so let's walk over this real fast. For the rot specifically, cut away the rot with a razor blade. Get a fresh, clean razor blade. Just the generic, cheap, square ones are perfect because they can get a nice, clean cut. Remove as much as possible for you of the dead tissue or the infected. So like, you know how you see it yellowy brown? Anything that's like that that's not a nice, bright, vibrant green, we want to remove. I know this means we're going to lose a reasonable amount of our rhizome in our heads, but trust me, this is one of the best ways to stop the problem from spreading further. From there, let's try to do a 50% water change once a week. Let's remove the Excel, and if we're not dosing Flourish Trace, we need to start dosing Flourish Trace, and I would dose it at least 3 times a week. I'm sure they'll tell you something specific based on the way you've been dosing as is, but I just generally think that like 3 days a week is pretty good. You can do it like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, right? And then you have your water change afterward and reset. You can let everything kind of drop down, and then Monday, redose it back up. But fit it into your schedule however you like. You're following the Flourish system. I'm assuming you do have Trace in there, but just in case you don't, let's make sure we're bringing Trace in, okay? Assuming we have Trace and we make those other changes, what's next? What's the other thing we need to look at? What we really want to watch, especially after we remove things, it is if we compare the two, right? We want to compare these two sides. Now, each Anubias has a slightly different need. We want to compare these two sides and see, are we continuously seeing good growth over here in the healthy side, and no new growth starts coming over in the side where we've seen the Anubias rot occurring? Because that's going to tell us either A, our nutrition's really not dispersing well enough, and maybe we need to adjust the way some of the flow patterns in the tank are with our filter and how we're doing those things, or we need to try and like almost literally spot dose some nutrition right over by those rhizomes to help make sure there's some right there available at the roots. If you want to get rid of the white stuff, the stuff that's leaching out of the woods, we're going to try not to call it a fungus, right? But that stuff, it is kind of just like a big nutrient dense slime. And a number of different fish love that. Autosynclists love it. A mono shrimp really love it. A number of snails love it. You could bring your Borneo suckers in. They probably would eat it, but they might also avoid it. So, like, if you wanted to use wildlife to do it, I wouldn't use an SAE or bristlenose, although bristlenose probably will eat it. They'll eat anything. I would look more towards something like an autosynclist or a mono shrimp, but if you do have a bristlenose that is kind of a tiny guy, so you know he's going to eat a ton, throw him in there. Can't hurt you. Really can't hurt you. That stuff's actually really nutritionally dense for a number of different fish species that tend to graze on like biofilms and stuff like that. It's basically like hyper-concentrated biofilm is the way to actually think about it as opposed to like a fungus, if that helps. I know, again, someone in the comments is going to beat me up and be like, that's not correct, Bentley. It's actually a blah, 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 blah. High-level thought. High-level thought. We're training our brain not to be perfect, but to think about it in a specific way that makes it easier to understand what's going on. Perfection's not the goal here. Perfection's not the goal here. Calm down. Just chill. It's okay. It's okay, boo-boo. Now, let's talk about those crypts. The balancing. I think what you need are root tabs. I think you have a little bit too much reliance on that big flourish system up in the water column. And because it's running kind of lean, I'm worried we're not getting enough absorbed down to the substrate, down to those deeper layers, because those crypts really do feed almost purely off the roots, especially things like Balancea, Retrospiralis, Spiralis, the ones that are the long, more grassy types. They really feed very heavily at their roots. So I want you to do two things. One, put a root tab in there. Maybe two. And I would do a root tab about once a month. That's probably sufficient. You could go get cheap ones from like Aquarium Co-op, Nylock G. You could get some fancier ones. Whatever your local store carries, if they have just like the Seachem Flourish tabs, those are great. They work great. They're easy peasy. Just shove them in there and shove them as deep down into substrate as you can get without doing something crazy and disturbing everything, right? Because what you want to do is encourage that to build a nice deep root system and feed off of those root tabs. And then all that extra nutrition by being deep will kind of get absorbed by the surrounding soil as opposed to ending up potentially some stuff up in the water column. What we want to do is make sure that we've got a nice, healthy set of nutrition right at the roots for those crypts. Because crypts are like super heavy root feeding. And if they aren't getting enough at the roots, that's where you start running into problems. And what's most likely occurring is you have enough nutrition for it to start growing up, but as it gets to the very top, it's kind of running a little too lean and it has to start consuming itself to stay alive. So what we want to do is kind of nip that thing in the bud by putting extra nutrition at the roots and kind of supercharging that nutrition uptake by making sure it's got lots of dedicated nutrition just for those crypts. And we can do this with any other species of crypt we have in the tank or any other kind of like more, say like you've got a Ponegetons or swords or anything like that love heavy root feeding. I would do the same thing if you were to go and add anything like that, or if you have something else around the tank that's been having a little trouble that you're not directly mentioning. Root tabs for Balancea. I think it's literally the only thing you need. Root tab. Done. Call it a day. One a month. Just plonk right under it. I think you'll start seeing them kick up and look a lot better pretty soon. 50% water change once a week. We want to kind of dilute the solution, help deal with some of the things that might be causing that rot, remove as much of the degraded rhizome as possible to where you only have the nice bright green, and more importantly, lightly feel it with your fingers. It should have a good firmness to it and not feel kind of squishy. If it feels squishy, it's probably already damaged and or infected, if that's the way you would prefer to think about it, and we need to remove that tissue too to be as safe as possible. And you'll be able to feel the difference. It will like have a like spongy texture as opposed to the, most rhizomes are fairly firm, but, don't think like a solid piece of wood or something. They have a little give. Don't get me wrong. Don't go try to crush the dang thing. Again, back to that crushing force problem. We just want to feel and make sure like, oh, yeah, this feels pretty healthy versus, it's kind of spongy and squishy. That's not good, right? This is what we want to do is remove all of that tissue. If it's yellowish or brownish, or if it feels very squishy and spongy, remove that tissue. Try to keep at least one leaf on it, maybe two, if you have to do some really aggressive cutting just to make sure that it's able to do some stuff. However, as long as nutrition is in there and the rhizome is healthy, it will regrow leaves a little faster than you think. So don't be too afraid, but let's try and keep some foliage there because we want to be able to make sure we're doing proper photosynthesis. And then the other thing is, like, let's look at our flow pattern, because maybe if it's only one side of the tank, maybe water's moving really good on this side where everything's healthy, and we're not getting enough movement, because Anubias really does like water movement. If water starts getting kind of stale and not moving a lot, that is when Anubias tends to have its problem. It's a riverine species, right? These are things that are epiphytes, typically found in or around stream and river systems that are used to a reasonable amount of flow, and that's what tends to keep them at their healthiest. So if we're having some flow issues, changing the flow or adding flow in some way, shape, or form to make sure that we've got good water movement over by this area where we've been having problems will help us out. That's what I got for you, Adrian. I hope that helps. Check back in with me in a couple of weeks or month. I know I'm a little behind on email as always, but I'm trying to get through as many of these as I can. Hopefully it's not too late and we can do some great success, and long term you can get the beautiful Anubias you've been looking for, because I like the selection you've got. Copperfolia is wonderful. The thick leaf Nana is amazing. Giant is pretty sweet. I've got some like Nangi over here in the Guppy Mansion that is enormous and it looks fantastic. But I've also dealt with Anubias having trouble and struggles, so I know where you're coming from, and hopefully I'm helping out. For the rest of you who are watching, let me know in the comments down below. Have you dealt with Anubias rot? How did you fix it? Have you never had to deal with Anubias rot because you're just perfect? What's your secret? Share that in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. Like, comment, subscribe. Those 3 things are absolutely free, and they tell old Papa YouTube, hey, I like what this person is doing, and someone else will too. It's the easiest way to help all of us grow and keep doing the kind of content that we love to do without having to shove ads down your face for things like mattresses and weird cereals. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.